to today's Energy Central webcast entitled, Understanding How a Targeted Demand Management Program Can Reduce Investments in New Infrastructure. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. Today's speakers are Steve Hambrick, Vice President, Strategic Sales and Operations for Converge, and Joe Halley, Manager, Energy Transformation and Solutions, Central Hudson Gas and Electric. I'm happy to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Steve Hambrick. Steve, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thanks, PJ. I was going to quickly introduce myself and have Joe introduce himself before launching into the content. We already got some great questions as people enrolled for the event, so we're going to answer or address some of those in line as we go, and then field some other ones at the end. In my role at Converge, I have a fantastic position where I get to collaborate with our team on and our clients on how we go to market, both through our strategy, the regulatory, sales operations, and ultimately strategic sales. And very happy to be here with Joe to talk about this program today. Joe, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm the Manager of Energy Transformation Solutions for Central Hudson Gas and Electric. And within that role, I have the responsibility for developing and executing all the responsibilities related to Central Hudson's REV initiatives. And REV is something we'll talk a little bit more about later. And those initiatives include new demonstration projects, such as an energy exchange, our targeted demand response programs, and microgrids. And also have been involved in some of the policy positions that the joint utilities have taken and worked with numerous stakeholders across the state to really help develop some policy in this reforming the energy vision proceeding that's taking place in New York.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. Could we go to the agenda, PJ? So quick agenda here. We're going to introduce the topic of targeted demand management, what are the drivers creating this, and then dive into the specific justification and program at Central Hudson, and wrap it up with Q&A. And as I mentioned, we'll be answering some questions as we go. Next, please. So wanted to first talk about a load pocket. And this is important because ultimately this is what we're trying to address through targeted demand management solutions. So these load pockets are areas where the T&D, transmission and distribution network, are unable to meet the peak demand. And these can be driven by multiple things, typically growth that has outpaced projections at the time the infrastructure was built. So it can be driven by population growth or other demographic changes. Traditionally, these load pockets have been solved by, especially on the distribution side, through additional investment in infrastructure. On the transmission side, they could also be addressed through dispatching higher cost generation to meet the load in the area. But essentially, the concept is we've got a relatively small area with a transmission or distribution constraint that we need to address somehow. And what we're going to talk about today is a solution that's gaining momentum, which is targeted demand management. Next, please. And so we're in an area where traditionally demand management, and DR in particular, has been viewed as a system-level resource. An analogy we use internally, and I think is often thought as a big red button you can hit 5 to 10 times a summer to reduce congestion across an entire system. And that's still certainly a valid use for DSM and DR in particular, but We're going to talk about some of the enabling factors next, but with new technology, we can think about these programs in a more sophisticated fashion and deploy into specific zones where we have the highest locational value of the resource. And the resource can be addressed to meet those specific local needs, not an average system level benefit. So it's targeted both in where we deploy the resources and also targeted in how we deploy it. So I can call an event in 2 zones and not the third. And in those 2 zones that I do call an event, those events could have completely different properties in terms of when and the duration and the shape of the load reduction. Very important concept. And as we mentioned, this can be a very cost-effective alternative to investments in transmission and distribution infrastructure. Next, please. So here's where we get into some of the drivers of why targeted demand management, some of the drivers both of the load pockets and why targeted demand management is a viable solution to them. The first thing we wanted to highlight, you'll often hear utilities and industry experts say that load growth is flat or even declining, and that's certainly true in a lot of areas. I think, Joe, you could speak to this for Central Hudson. I think overall your system load is flat, but the system load and peak load are not necessarily coordinated, and system load and peak load in certain micro areas within a region could have a different correlation than the overall average. So this is again getting to a much more nuanced and targeted solution where we're identifying kind of specific area problems and solving them. So with the changes in demographics, you've got industry moving around, and you've got you've got solar and other items shifting peaks or splintering peaks. We're creating a whole host of local distribution challenges that need a solution. So that's a market driver for these load pockets. The second bucket here is a set of technologies that are actually drivers for why targeted demand management is a viable solution and now a more viable solution to meeting the constraints of those load pockets. So we've got here Wi-Fi thermostats, solar, electric vehicles, which can be a storage option, and we have finally the Tesla Powerwall, so a storage option, a pure residential behind the meter storage option. So these technologies are evolving quickly and growing in adoption, and this enables us to have a more powerful stack of solutions to meet the demands of the specific load pocket. One of the things, to give you a preview of what you'll see later, is we've focused on the solution for Central Hudson more on traditional demand management, things like EE and DR. That's because they're in many environments often more cost effective and have a deeper market penetration. But we absolutely are keeping an eye on these other technologies. They're very compelling and can be very supportive of an overall holistic solution down the road. We're talking about the current state, which is more traditional DSM, but we want to highlight that as these other technologies become more widely spread, it's much more critical to integrate with them and coordinate with them. And I think hopefully answered a question that recently came in about how targeted demand management is being integrated with higher levels of solar penetration. The last item here is the final critical component for how we use TDM to solve these load pockets is regulatory reform. And this is a very important point because we need to have the right regulatory construct to encourage utilities to seek out and deliver these TDM solutions. We're going to be talking about that in more detail down the road in the context of Central Hudson. But wanted to highlight two areas. I'm going to talk about California, and Joe's going to talk about New York. These two areas where there's some exciting progress. So in California, I think most on the call are aware of the San Onofre nuclear generating station being decommissioned, which created some local constraints. And the CPUC directed SDG&E and SCE to target demand response at 4 substations in the area that were impacted by the SONG's decommissioning. And I believe SCE is in the second phase of a RFO process to help address some of those local constraints. Additionally, there's a distribution resources plan, DRP, that's been initiated statewide to work with the utilities to identify ideal places for TDM solutions to meet local constraints. So I wanted to highlight there that there's a lot of activity and focus in California, and they're creating a formal mechanism with the DRP to identify areas that could be solved by TDM solutions. And I'd like to hand it over to you, Joe, to talk about New York and REV.
Thanks, Steve. And before I talk too much about REV, I'd just like to introduce everybody to Central Hudson for those of you that aren't familiar with us. Central Hudson is a smaller utility within what I would call upstate New York, but most people would call it mid-state. But anything above New York City is really upstate. We account for about 3% of the state by load share, and we're located in the mid-Hudson Valley, really from the fringes of Westchester County up to the tip of Albany County, which is where our state capital resides, all along the Hudson River. We have about 300,000 electric customers and 75,000 gas customers that we provide service for. And that's really Central Hudson in a nutshell, smaller upstate utility in New York. And moving on to REV, which is, formally known as Reforming the Energy Vision, but anyone that's a participant in it at this point is now just shortening it to REV. Our governor officially kicked off REV in 2014, and the proceeding is really closely aligned with the New York State energy goals that target 2030 as the year that we're really going to have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. We're going to recast the New York generation mix to 50% renewable, and we're going to decrease energy consumption in buildings by 23%. So they're pretty ambitious goals, but they get more ambitious when you look at what REV is adding to them. REV goes a step further and states that affordability, system resiliency, and really the empowerment of customer choice, those are the goals, and then it outlines that the strategy necessary to achieve those goals will really be primarily through the development of markets that value the contribution of DERs and the value that they provide to the grid. So just quickly going through this, from a procedural perspective, REV is really progressing on 2 separate tracks at this point. They're very interrelated and intertwined, and decisions occurring in one track impact the other. But track 1 is primarily focused on outlining the future role of utilities, customers, and DER providers. An order was issued on February 26th on track 1 that really established the utility as a distribution services platform provider, which means that the utility is really going to have the role of providing the platform that facilitates market access to customers and third parties. A DSIP, or really the utility's plan to develop the DSP capabilities, is required to be filed by June 30th of 2016. And so the utilities in New York are really working hard on developing what our plans are to deliver that. And definitely non-wires alternative or targeted demand response solutions will be a part of those DSIPs. Track 2 is really about changing the utility business model in order to align utilities with the goals of REV and incent utility actions and outcomes so that we're more aligned with those goals, and developing values for DERs. And that's really going to be through the development of a value called the value of D, which is this hypothetical value that DERs can provide to the distribution system. So we're all spending a lot of time thinking about how that value can be defined. And we expect that to also potentially include a replacement for net metering within 2016. So really, in order to begin aligning with the goals of REV, we included 4 REV initiatives within our rate case that we filed in July of 2014. One of those initiatives was a non-wires alternative, or a targeted demand response project. And on May 1st, we filed exactly what more details regarding our non-wires alternative. And that report was really an outcome of a multi-stakeholder working group that was established within our rate case to work on REV initiatives. And the report really detailed the purpose and goals of our targeted demand response program and led to the approval of that program in 2015. Next slide, please. So our program, which will be called Peak Perks, the goal of our program is really to defer CapEx. And I can't stress that enough. The reason that this program makes sense is it allows us to defer very specific capital projects that we would have otherwise needed. And so when we defer those capital projects, it allows us to save dollars for all customers. So we would have invested in certain capital infrastructure programs. We put the non-wires alternative project in place, and we're able to defer that CapEx. So we spent a great deal of time with the Department of Public Service staff vetting our planned capital expenditures. And although I'm sure it seemed like we spent more time on these projects and really vetting them, providing line drawings, providing estimates, providing all the detail that you could imagine on really making these projects concrete and helping our regulator understand these projects. It seemed like we spent more time on these projects than on the remainder of our capital budget combined, because it was really important to get it right. The deferral or delaying the investment in these capital projects is really the basis of the value that we can provide to all customers, and really is what we can then take and monetize and create incentives for those customers that are going to participate. So really, when I talked about value of D earlier, the value of D in my mind is really the value that can be produced by deferring capital projects. And that, from the utilities perspective, is the cap. That's the cap we can establish for these programs to operate under. We then went out and looked for potential program partners to bid on our program, and they then really developed the market price signal for the value of D. And that's really appropriate, because we didn't want to provide our potential program partners with that value of D up front, because then they could have bid maybe $1 under what those T&D investments would have cost us. So we really wanted the market to provide the cost of the solution so that we could have a market-based price of the value of D. And so in that way, we really developed the value of D through market forces. Any delta between the value of D that we decided, or really the CapEx deferral, and the value of D that our prospective program partners decided, really the cost of the solution, can be monetized and provided to all customers. It can be provided to our program partner as payment for running the program, and it can be provided to the customers participating in the program as an incentive. And that's really important because there needs to be that delta to provide customers with compensation for us running with a non-traditional investment versus a traditional T&D investment, and that's because the non-traditional solution includes risk. It includes risk associated with customer adoption, with a large load potentially coming online in one of those targeted areas and having to go ahead with the capital investment anyway. And also because at this point we're unfamiliar with these types of solutions. This is the first time that Central Hudson has attempted a targeted demand response project, and we're now moving into this realm. So our unfamiliarity with these solutions versus the traditional T&D investment is a source of risk as well. Next slide, please.
Hey, Joe. I just wanted to ask you a clarifying question. You mentioned that customer engagement and customer choice, there are some other outcomes that you're expecting to get out of this program, but for the case of calculating D, it was solely based upon deferred capital investment. Is that correct?
So, yes, the value of D is really short for value of distribution system. And from our perspective, we look at the value of the distribution system as the deferral of CapEx. There are other values that can come to play within this type of program, and one of those may be capacity market values or wholesale commodity price reductions that may occur due to this program. Was that a full answer to your question, Steve?
It was. Thank you.
So really, and Steve alluded to this earlier, that there is a difference between a system-wide program and a targeted program. And it's really important to look at the differences between a system-wide program and the targeted program. And they both have benefits and drawbacks, but really the reason that we're pushing targeted programs today, and we really believe in our Peak Perks targeted program, is that within the targeted program you can really assess which capital projects you're going to defer and able to monetize that delay and provide your customers with value. That's a known. Within a system-wide program, it's a little bit more subjective. It's based on historical investments based on load growth. And I think that's important because today we're not seeing much load growth. When you look at our average peak demand growth on a system-wide basis, excluding our targeted areas, it's a negative number. It's very low, close to flat. And that's also reflected in our capital budgets today. Today, our capital budgets are primarily dominated with aging infrastructure replacement projects. They're not really load growth oriented. So in Central Hudson's case, our capital budgets are primarily aging infrastructure, and then there's some programs that really will allow us to get up to speed with our DSP capabilities and provide some other customer benefits such as distribution automation and network strategy. But that is the heart of our capital budget, is aging infrastructure and then those REV foundational investments. It's not projects based on peak demand growth. We also, when you look at the system as a whole, we have a lot of headroom when you look at distribution capacity. And so with that headroom, if we shave peak, we're not really providing any value today. We're on the distribution side. And that's because the investments that are creating that headroom have already been made, and they're already in place and operating today. So that's pretty important to realize when we talk about a system-wide program and really thinking about system-wide. When we look at our Peak Perks program, we had very defined capital projects that we could defer and really monetize that delay. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a little bit more clarity on where the targeted areas are within Central Hudson Service Territory and really the system needs that we're trying to fulfill. So within our north, and you can also tell that these areas are pretty spread out within our service territory. It's not all lumped together. The Northwest Corridor is really the portion of our service territory. This is the biggest area that we're looking to find a non-wire solution. We're really looking to find 10 megawatts of demand response, and that will defer the capital project that was planned to go into service here in 2019. It'll defer that project for 10 years. Our Fishkill Plains, really, again, 5 megawatts, deferral for 7 years, and then Merritt Park, a 1 megawatt need through demand response that'll get us a deferral for 5 years. So you can see that there's a lot of variation here between the areas, the size of the needs that we have here, the length of the deferral, and really even the types of capital projects that were planned here span transmission, distribution, and substation projects that are going to be able to be delayed or deferred because of our demand response programs. Next slide, please. So I've discussed really the system needs that allow us to place a dollar value on the program, but the heart of this program is really customer adoption and engagement, and understanding our customers' demographics, needs, and their ability to participate in the program is really what's extremely important here. So just to give a few details, the customers in these areas account for approximately 20% of Central Hudson's total electric customer base. 84% of the customers in these areas are residential. And due to a 2012 appliance saturation survey that our energy efficiency department conducted, we know that approximately 32% of the customers throughout our entire service territory have access to central air conditioning. So pretty low penetration of central air throughout our entire service territory, and we'd extrapolate that continues through these areas. We also utilized Nexent as a third-party evaluator that looked at our program needs, evaluated the bids we received for our program, and they really provided a lot more clarity on the load profiles of the different targeted areas. So when we looked at the load profiles, we could see that each area had slightly different peak durations. Although they're relatively similar, they're different durations, and the needs obviously in each area were different. The cooling load as a percent of peak ranged anywhere from 46% to 62% in the different areas. And really the cooling load accounted for approximately 40 megawatts of peak in all the targeted areas. So when we're looking at what we need to shave, we can shave it all with cooling load, but we don't know if that's central air or if that's window air conditioning units. So it's really important to be able to distinguish between those two types of cooling load, but we know that it's definitely weather sensitive. And so knowing that information really allowed us to work and spend a lot of time with Converge and design a program that's really going to meet our system needs, allow for customer engagement, and provide value to all the customers within our service territory. And so really it's important to look at the Peak Perks program and what we're trying to do within that program. We're trying to enroll all of the different customer classes and include many different types of DR. So for larger commercial customers, that may include building control systems. And then when we get to the residential class, the primary driver of this program will be control thermostats. But then we'll also be including some other devices that will augment that reduction from cooling equipment, such as water heaters, pool pumps, and agricultural pumps. And those will really help round out the program so that we can ensure we get the peak shave that we need. Additionally, we're really going to look to cross-promote programs within these targeted areas. So for the pool pumps specifically, we may be able to find some energy efficiency cross-promotion. But also, you know, when you have a contractor inside a customer's house switching out a thermostat, it might also be a good time for them to look up and see if they can spot any incandescent light bulbs and hopefully switch those out with LED to provide energy efficiency savings. And potentially, you know, depending on when that lighting was going to be on, provide a tiny bit of peak shave capability. So, and then it's really important to talk too, in order to plan this entire program and provide the comfort that our regulator needs and that our planning department needs, we had to ensure that we could hit the goals that we developed. And so we developed milestones that are really checkpoints that serve to get a status update on the program and to ensure that we don't need to start the preliminary engineering activities to develop our traditional T&D solutions. So approximately halfway through each program, the first milestone is at the end of 16 within one of our targeted areas, and then we have another milestone in 2017 that's coming up pretty quick. But those milestones will look to see exactly what megawatt attainment we've gotten in each area and to see if that really puts us on the path to get the full 16 megawatts we need in all of those areas by the time that we would have built the traditional T&D solution. So those milestones are pretty important and will really give us a status check to see that we're on the right path. And then finally, Central Hudson has really proposed this shared savings model for the development of a utility incentive. Before I talked about the delta between the system value of D or the value of D that's created by deferring the capital projects and the solution value of D or the cost-based value of D, the market. And that delta between those two values is really the value that will be provided to our customers. And it's also something that can be utilized to incent utilities to look for more of these projects. And the reason that's important is because these are definitely cross-functional projects. They require many different departments within the utility to work together to find these solutions. And they're really, I mean, they're a brain drain for the organization. Some of the smartest people we have within the company had to work on these projects to make sure that we're getting them right, and because they are so complicated and very new to the company. So realizing all that and realizing that it's the early stages of these types of programs, we recommended that a share of those savings be provided to the utility to further incent more of these programs being developed. And with that, I'll turn it back to Steve.
Thanks, Joe. Before we flip the slide, I think that the utility incentive model is important to maybe talk about a little bit more. It's something that I get asked about a lot out in the field, talking both to utilities and regulators. I think it's no secret that the traditional asset rate of return model would actually hurt a utility choosing to invest in a TDM solution over a capital investment. So everyone knows that. So the question is how do we create a model that encourages utilities with their limited resource and has them put skin in the game so that they can earn a sufficient share of that delta for going down this path that requires their best resources and maybe is outside of their, or could be outside of their comfort zone in terms of how they deliver a solution versus the tried and true method of iron in the ground. That's a process that seems to be playing itself out in New York and California and in some other areas that I don't think none of us know the right answer or even where the first answers are going to lay, but it seems to be a very critical component of how we get utilities to help TDM solutions achieve their potential. Okay, on to the next slide. So this is a bit of an eye chart. I wanted to quickly give you a more detailed overview of the technology and the solutions that are part of the Peak Perks program. I think there are a couple of guiding principles here. Number one is we needed to get every megawatt available. And so to do that, we wanted to target all types of load, not just one solution like central air conditioners, but get pool pumps, water heaters, commercial solutions like ag pumps, get all the load we can. And then we needed to get as much of it as possible. So targeting all customer classes and diving really deep into penetration. I think Joe mentioned earlier, we were targeting greater than 50% of eligible customers in some cases being enrolled into the program. So we needed to have an attractive offer and get it in front of those customers with aggressive marketing. So with those two principles, one is we need to get to capture all reasonable load sources, and B, that we need to get them from as many customers and types of customers as possible. That's how we built this program. And you can see that we have a full turnkey set of solutions from developing the program design and incentives and getting out and marketing it, enrolling the customers, doing the installations, managing the assets and keeping them online and servicing any customer inquiries, direct installing thermostats and switches both in commercial and residential applications to get, again, multiple kinds of load. Also capturing the bring your own thermostat market by getting customers in the load zones to install devices that would be useful for the specific load requirements in the zones. And then Joe mentioned coordinating with other DSM programs. There's two real benefits here. One is that we make our offer more attractive and cost effective by doing other things while we're on site, like LEDs and other energy efficient programs. The second is those also help reduce coincident peak demand on those hot days. So in addition to making the program more cost effective and attractive, we're also to some extent lowering load. So that's the overview of the program, and I wanted to also highlight that we're running it all through our DRMS IntelliSource, and this is important for two reasons. One is this is ultimately a very complex program. We have a lot of different solutions being deployed, a lot of marketing activity happening, and a lot of incentives, and we want to make sure this is done in an integrated and coordinated fashion so that we get everything right and we deliver a great experience for the customers. And this is really because we can't afford to lose customers. If we lose a customer, the incremental cost of replacing them is high. You know, as you get to a higher and higher market penetration, there's just not that many potential targets left. So for every customer we lose due to any kind of issue with the program, the cost of replacing them and getting back that kilowatt will be substantial. So by having a fully integrated solution, we'll have one source of truth and a totally integrated experience all the way from the call center down to the device in the home. So that was very important to us in terms of the program design and its impact on program performance. Next, please. So this is where we have a bit of time to kind of nerd out around specific in-home technologies and what their different advantages are. I mentioned that a very key part of this program design was deploying different DERs and using them for their relative strengths and in fact covering up their relative weaknesses. So if you treat every type of DER the same, then you force everything to look like an apple, and you may or may not get the best properties out of the different solutions. And candidly, we've seen that in some procurements across the country where they've tried to make everything, if you try to make a water heater compete with a central air conditioner, compete with a commercial lighting solution, all on the same terms, you're not going to get the best out of each of those assets. So one of the things that we really appreciated was the flexibility with Central Hudson to stack up these assets and use them to their strengths. And we wanted to highlight a couple of items here that are relevant. One is, obviously there's how much load you get out of the device in a typical curtailment scenario. There's how long you can call the device. When you release the device from control, does it have a snapback? That's important to us because some items may need to be released in mid-event. What does that do to our overall curtailment delivery? And what's the impact on the customers? Does it do longer or more frequent events start to wear down the customer and potentially impact customer retention and satisfaction with the program? Those are all very important components. And I have some additional comments here. These have some other relative strengths and applicability depending on the situation in the home. For example, we wouldn't go recruit a customer to put a water heater switch on if we weren't already going there for some other measure like a pool pump or a central air conditioning switch. There's just not enough load to make it worth our while. But in the event we are visiting at a home, we would love to get as many water heaters as we can. Electric water heaters, of course. And a quick example that may be worth talking about is, the central air conditioning is obviously the foundation of the system. There's a lot of great flexibility, in particular with the Wi-Fi thermostats, where we're able to see exactly into the home and custom tailor the curtailment event. But you do have issues curtailing customers more than 4 hours. We've got to maintain comfort in the home. And so we need to be careful how we deploy these central air conditioning controlling Wi-Fi thermostats. And with pool pumps, we don't expect to have a lot of events in the summer. So there's no problem with curtailing a pool pump for 8 hours or even more. You're not going to have any impact on the customer, and you're not going to have any snapback when you release that pool pump from the event. So that means we deploy these items separately. With central air conditioning, we really need to watch that temperature rise in the house, regardless of the duration of the event, and manage the fan accordingly for comfort. With pool pumps, it may not be as cost-effective on a per kilowatt basis, but it's something we can call again and again as required and as long as we need to. So that's just a quick example of how we use different devices differently in the program. And I had a couple of questions that I was going to jump in quickly with now before we get to the last summary slide, Joe. We had a question on how we quantify the load reduction of various appliances in the home. That's based upon the historical experience. We've worked with these residential and commercial equipments for decades and have a lot of data and how they'll respond in an environment like Central Hudson. So it's based on historic data. Another question we had was we had a couple questions on how behavioral demand response could stack up in a solution like this. And that's definitely an interesting tool for lowering system level loads. To our knowledge, it hasn't been tested on a targeted basis, so that would be interesting to see. One of the things you can see in these, in some of the criteria on this slide is that it's important that we have flexible resources that can be called at different times of the day and for different durations, and potentially on short notice. These are all things where behavioral demand response doesn't stack up very well. It also requires AMI, which is something we don't have at Central Hudson. So in this case, it wasn't a good fit, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be a good fit down the road. We just need to make sure whatever resources, to Joe's point about the the midstream megawatt targets that we've got to demonstrate success on, whatever resource we include and budget around, it's got to show up when we call it. So certainly keeping an eye on new technologies like BDR. There was another question, Joe, since I mentioned AMI in the context of BDR, on the importance of AMI in targeted demand management solutions. And to add my own editorial on it, it may be interesting too to think about that from a rev market perspective. If you're talking about the value of D and a local value of D, there's certainly a role you could see in a market-based solution that AMI would support.
Yeah, so definitely. I think there's definitely a role for AMI. I think AMI can facilitate market prices, and it definitely allows more information to be provided about what the customer is doing, what an individual customer is doing, and how they're interacting with certain price signals or different rate tariffs. The issue with AMI is that it's expensive. And there are a lot of costs that come along with AMI. It's not just the fact that you already have meters out there that now become stranded and you still need recovery of those capital costs, but an AMI meter is significantly more expensive than a traditional meter, and it comes with the requirement to backhaul all the data that's coming off of the AMI meter back to your headquarters or to some other facility where you can actually analyze the data. So there's a lot of communications costs as well. So there's just overall a number of cost components that are integrated into rolling out an AMI deployment. And here at Central Hudson, we've looked at that a few years ago, and it's probably time for us to refresh our business case. But we looked at it a few years ago, and we couldn't come up with a concrete number of benefits that would offset the concrete costs. So there are a few other utilities in New York that are looking to roll out AMI, and they are, as I said before, most utilities are bigger than Central Hudson. They are larger than Central Hudson, and so for a lot of those costs that are scalable, like IT infrastructure on the back end, or are not scalable, they're paying the same amount as we are. So overall, the entire solution should have a smaller impact on their individual ratepayers. And so we're looking to understand, when they deploy this, what are the concrete benefits that they're seeing. When we look at business cases across the country, we haven't been able to glean those concrete benefits that would really offset the cost we would incur. And so really it's from a customer perspective, we're looking at our customers and really keeping the bills affordable. And that's been the reason that at Central Hudson we've pushed back on an AMI deployment, because the cost that our customers would see in our minds at this point, when we would put pen to paper, don't justify the costs.
Great. Well, should we go to the last slide, PJ, and Joe can sum up, and if we have time, maybe we can answer a question or two. We tried to answer some in line, but there's been a ton of fantastic questions. We may have to follow up afterwards. So throughout many of the slides, I think we touched on almost all of the topics that are listed here. So I'm going to just briefly jump through a couple of them that maybe we haven't put enough emphasis on. So Steve and I both touched on coordinated marketing, and as you'll see at the top of the slide, we have our brand name for our program, SendHub Peak Perks. And
throughout 2016, we're really looking to market many of our programs under an umbrella and really push forward a lot of cross-promotion and cross-marketing between demand response, energy efficiency, and any other potential demonstration projects that come out that would really be customer-facing. Looking to really look at managing the technologies and looking at the strengths of individual technologies. As I said earlier, we had a third-party evaluator, Nexent, that came in and really helped us with this. And really part of that was looking at different technologies and how they stack up when you look at the load profile in each of the zones, what that peak looks like, which hours the peak is occurring over, and the intensity of that peak, and then comparing that to different technologies and whether or not they would cover the peak or if they would have to be augmented by stacking other technologies on top. So some of the technologies we looked at were solar, battery storage, controllable thermostats, and really when we looked at all of those, we found that each of those technologies had individual strengths, but at this point, what we felt was best capable of matching the greatest percentage of the peak and getting the highest customer adoption in the turnaround time that we needed was really the stack that we picked up with Converge. We're still looking at other technologies, and we'll continue to look at other technologies in other areas as well. But I think, really looking at different technologies and comparing them to the peak that you have is important. And then really looking in M&V and really understanding how we're shaving the peak is going to be important within this program so that we can apply those learnings to other potential targeted demand response programs in the future. So I think Converge has really provided a good solution there and really is allowing us to see exactly what's happening at each individual customer's premise and being able to then aggregate that up to see what peak reduction we've gotten in each area. And then finally, pushing over to the business impact, there are a number of potential business impacts that this will have for Central Hudson. And one that we really haven't touched on too much is improving customer satisfaction. So that's something that we're really interested in seeing how that carries out, providing a new product to customers that really is marketed not on reducing peak, but is marketed based on the rewards that they get by enrolling in the program. Some of them being intangible. Obviously, they'll get incentives for enrolling and staying within the program. That's one reward. But they'll also have functionality that some of our other customers may not get, and that functionality will come free with that programmable thermostat. So having a Wi-Fi enabled thermostat and really being able to interact with that comes with this program. So we're really looking to see how that improves customer satisfaction. And then monetizing the impact of peak reduction in the NISO is something that we're really exploring and looking at a few different options as to how to do that. And we think that there is definitely the opportunity to monetize peak reduction, but we're looking at exactly how to ensure that that can be monetized and what procedures need to be put in place here and how we can work with Converge to do that.
Okay, great. Should we go to the Q&A slide, PJ? We've got 6 minutes left. There was one topic that came up quite a bit, Joe, from the viewers, and that was around the incentives, both in terms of the equipment and the program and the financial incentives. Would you mind touching on that?
So I can talk a little bit about the incentives and how they make sense from a Central Hudson system perspective. Steve, it might make more sense if then you added on and said how they might make sense from a customer perspective.
Okay.
From a Central Hudson system perspective, really, as I said before, we really took the deferral of those capital projects and really looked at that value that we could then provide to our customers. And if you think about that value and say it's and this is just a number I'm throwing out there, $1 million, you can say that $1 million should go to all of our customers because they're taking on some risk with a non-wires alternative versus a traditional T&D. So let's say half of it goes to our entire customer base. The remainder, that second half, that other $500,000, can then be split to cover the program costs, and it can be utilized to pay for incentives for our customers to participate in the program. And those incentives really should be set at a level that gets our customers engaged and keeps our customers within the program so that we can ensure the program's running and really allows us to defer that CapEx. And Steve, I'll let you go into exactly how we set, what those dollar levels needed to be to engage the customer.
Okay. And a big goal from the customer perspective is to overcome any real or perceived resistance to program participation. And we did that in two ways. One was by taking all barriers out of the program, and two, through a robust marketing campaign that had customer choice and some great incentives for it. So in terms of removing all the barriers for the customers, we offer a free installation and free equipment scheduled at the customer's convenience. And for those that do not or are unable or unwilling to schedule an in-home appointment for someone to come into the home and install Wi-Fi connected thermostats, we can put a switch on the outside of the home. So if a customer wants to participate, they don't need to go to the store, they don't need to buy anything, they don't need to lift a finger. They can either be there for an appointment, or if they can't even do that, we'll come by and put a switch on the outside of the home. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible for the customer to participate. And that's really important as you get to these higher levels of penetration. As you get into the 20–30%, you start getting new levels of resistance. But as you start exceeding 50–55% of central air conditioning customers, driving them to participate, you really don't want there to be any perceived barriers. So that's a huge element of the program design. And then the second one is, let's make it a compelling offer that's readily available through a dynamic marketing program with attractive cash incentives. So we obviously think the thermostats are very compelling. We're offering multiple thermostat models to the customer where they'll be able to manage the device in their home comfort through their Wi-Fi, their phone via Wi-Fi connection. But also switches that they can use to capture other load like pool pumps and hot water heaters. I'm kind of focused on residential, but the same analogy applies to commercial and water heaters. So to the extent the customer has interest in other electric appliances that could be part of the program, we'll enroll them and increase so that they have choice in how they participate and to what depth they participate. We'll make this very clear through multi-channel marketing and community engagement. And then once they enroll, the incentives are very attractive. I think we have an $85 base enrollment for one thermostat or switch that goes up as we add additional appliances in the home, and then a recurring incentive at the end of the control season for those customers that participated in a conforming number of events that season. That again varies based upon the level of participation, but high enough that it's meaningful and attractive. So again, the premise were remove barriers, customer choice and convenience, and get an attractive offer out there through multi-channel marketing. And I think we're up at the end, PJ. I need to kick it back to you to wrap up. Is that right?
Yep. Yep, that's right. Thank you, Steve. And thanks, Joe. Fantastic presentation. For our audience, as you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. We hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you for attending. This concludes our discussion.